Yes, we have. This is the psychedelics panel of this day in the Cannabis conference. We have a wonderful panel. Well, we'll be discussing two things mostly. Those who are eager to hear psychedelic finance, you have to stick to the end of the panel because we are going to be discussing science and businesses and market outlooks first. And by the second half of the panel, we'll be going into financials and how the financial markets are developing, have been developing, and maybe what the future looks for finance. But first, let's do a little round of introductions. Just everyone maybe speak to the audience. Tell us who you are, what are you doing in this industry, and what companies do you represent. So, Joseph, if you would like to start, and then we can just go around the circle.
Sure. Thanks, Natan, and thanks again for the opportunity to be here. It's great to see everybody again. So my name is Dr. Joseph Tucker. I'm the CEO of Magic Med Industries. At Magic Med, we're totally focused on creating new molecules, new variants of psychedelics, employing synthetic biology and chemistry to create new molecules for this sector.
Wonderful. Hugh, how about you?
Hi there. I'm the CEO and director of Psychotherapy Corp. We're an investment accelerator and incubator with a number of programs in psychedelic medicine, including API production, drug formulation, and some molecular engineering.
Oh, Sylvia?
Hi, I'm Sylvia. I work at Defiance ETFs. I'm the CIO there. So we provide investors with basically exposure to dynamic subsectors. We like to think of ourselves as the next generation of investing. And one of the ETFs we've recently built is around psychedelics. So it's the Defiance, we call it the altered experienced ETF, but it's essentially psychedelics and cannabis in an ETF wrapper.
I was writing about your ETF just this morning.
Yeah, nice. I appreciate that.
So James.
Well, thanks, Natan. So my name is James Lantier. I'm the CEO of Mindset Pharma. We're a public company traded on the CSE. We're a biotechnology company, and our focus is on discovering and developing next generation psychedelic drugs. So next generation molecules that have really been optimized for use as pharmaceutical drugs for the widest possible population groups.
Wonderful. Cool. So to begin, our idea here was to discuss and share some ideas around two possible paradigms of application of psychedelics in general, which are sort of presenting themselves today. One that is gaining ground and is probably going to dominate the industry in the next 3 to 5 years as psychedelics come into legality. And then another paradigm which might be the future of psychedelics and is going to start being involved in the industry as well. The first one is basically what we refer to as psychedelics-assisted psychotherapy, which is treatment in clinics using psychedelics to assist talk therapy and to do mental health progress with the company of a professional, a trained therapist, and always in a clinic. And with the development that is going on and that many companies are doing today with second generation psychedelics, we see the possibility of bringing this type of substances for people to use at their homes without professional supervision by altering some of the traits of psychedelics for reduced risk and other benefits that could allow eventually for people to be taking these psychedelics at home. So would anyone like to begin introducing what psychedelics-assisted psychotherapy is and how the market is evolving to accommodate for this type of therapies and clinics? If anyone feels comfortable with this, just raise your hand and we can begin the conversation there. Or I can assign you. you want to go, Sylvia? Cool.
Sure, I can try. So
Yeah.
I think, first it's good to kind of, define it a little bit. So psychedelics are thought to be medicines that basically target a subset of the brain and serotonin receptors. So, in layman's terms, I was told by a professor that it just allows the brain to communicate in different ways than other medicines do, or people who have or suffer from severe mental illness are able to communicate within their own brain. So the most popular types of psychedelics that are being sort of studied now and researched now are LSD, MDMA, and psilocybin, magic mushrooms, basically. And some of these drugs are drugs similar to the form of what these are looking like now, have been used since 1600 BC back in Greece for, both mystical ceremonies and alternative medicine. So they've been around for a long time. So it's really interesting about this, and how we get here is that, for the last, if we look at the last few decades, there has been almost no growth and innovation within pharmaceuticals when it comes to mental illness, whereas you've seen major advancements in other fields of medicine, like cardiology, for example, immunology. Think about how fast the COVID vaccine came out. But mental illness medications aren't really experiencing that same growth. But we just see this spike in mental illness, particularly depression, worldwide. So in the world, there are apparently officially diagnosed 700 million people with some sort of mental illness, and the cost to treat them is 2.5 trillion, but 30% of them are never treated. So that 30% is sort of where all of this comes in. There are a lot of trials that are being done where these medicines, these psychedelics, are being administered to patients along with psychotherapy. So that means that, a professional healthcare worker, psychotherapist, psychologist, someone sort of familiar with this, is sitting in a room with a patient who is experiencing this sort of trip by taking this medicine. So it's been really interesting because Cornell has had some studies come out where, LSD has allowed these patients with severe mental illness, particularly PTSD and veterans, to kind of come out the other side. A group called MAPS is in phase 3 trials on the use of MDMA, for example. So they've had loads of people essentially with a targeted psychotherapist taking the medicine and then sort of talking through what's going on, helping their brain communicate in a different way. And after a year of the psychotherapy coupled with the medicine, 2/3 of them are deemed cured and no longer suffering from PTSD or whatever that illness is. So some of these initial results are leading us to believe that, 2/3 is a big number, right? They say it's more like 75% actually, but this leads us to believe that with, targeted psychotherapy and the use of this alternative medicine where classic antidepressants have failed, there's sort of hope for the most severe mental illness patients. And, a lot of these clinics, I think, Rick Doblin, who runs the MAP study, he recently said that by the end of 2021, he expects to have, sort of approval based on the phase 3 results with the FDA. And from that, we'll see psychedelic clinics open up all over the US. So, this is very much sort of happening and growing and becoming, it feels like it's becoming decriminalized anyway. It's happening in Oregon and Colorado already, but psychedelics coupled with psychotherapy seems to be a new mental illness option and perhaps an innovation after decades of, stale results.
Well, that was a wonderful intro to what psychedelics-assisted psychotherapy is, the research and the possible market outlook. And so, Sylvia, while we're here, since you launched the Psychedelics ETF quite recently, I imagine that you did you zoomed over the entire space to look at all of the companies that you wanted to include in your ETF. How much of your coverage would you say includes companies that are applying psychedelics-assisted psychotherapy in clinics right now, and how much are you looking into the future for companies that are developing, future treatments? If you can put it in I don't know, percentages or how much they weigh. Yeah.
So it's a tricky thing, right? Because when you launch an ETF in the U.S. anyway, you have a 1940 Act. requirement, and companies have to be of a certain size. They have to have a certain amount of liquidity and market cap and things like that. So for us, we have every pure company that does psychedelics research in our ETF that has that 70 million market cap and that 500 average ADV number that's sort of like required for us. And then, there's a mix of cannabis companies in there. So it's about 50-50. But what we try to do is get every company that is investing in researching psychedelics. And then, sort of that, when you fall into like what the rules allow, that comes out to like 6 or 7 companies. So then the next level was companies that derive 50% of their revenues from psychedelics or cannabis. And then, sort of it ends with cannabis. But as the companies continue to grow, I've had a bunch of CEOs reach out to us, like, can you put our company in your ETF for pure psychedelics and whatnot? But, as soon as those companies sort of get further investments and grow to a point that they're big enough to comply with the rules, we're definitely going to include them. Our goal is to have the pure psychedelics ETF out there.
That's wonderful. Okay, but the potential psychedelics doesn't end there, and these compounds give us a lot of other wonderful opportunities for treating mental health. So James, maybe would you like to introduce us to what your company is doing, and everyone else feel free to also chime in if you feel like you have something interesting to share. But tell us what you're doing in taking these sort of first generation molecules that are going to be applied soon in clinics, and how that can be translated into something even better for patients.
Sure. So and that Sylvia, that was an excellent introduction. I think what I'd add to that, and as it relates to mindset, is to pick up on one of the themes that Sylvia mentioned. We're very much psychedelics are not a new thing at all. They've been around for thousands of years. The current molecules that a lot of the groups are working with today are also not particularly new, and the use of those drugs as therapeutic agents, it isn't new either. So psilocybin was marketed and sold as psilocybin in the 1960s, and for psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. LSD was used to treat alcoholism. Like it's not a new use of the drugs. And really, we're here today on this panel, and the industry is where it is thanks to the work of these different not-for-profit groups like MAPS, USONA, so on, that had a lot of conviction and were able to advance research and clinical trials to show that the drugs were mainly safe, not addictive, and had this therapeutic benefit. To us at Mindset, the gap, or the opportunity was all that work had gone into proving that these first generation drugs were potentially useful and helping kind of really change the minds of regulators around the drugs. But to us, it was kind of the natural next step to apply, the scientific method and pharmaceutical, discovery models to try to extend the drugs and really to try to create, drugs that did an even better job, that were less toxic, and that potentially were more predictable and potentially had a more convenient duration. And so that's really what we're trying to do. And in our view as well, the big commercial opportunity would be in second and third generation drugs, because the well-known drugs, MDMA, psilocybin, LSD, pretty much you name it, they're all in the public domain. And so for the real investment to be made in the space to make it possible for the space to grow and flourish, it would really require drugs that enjoyed full patent protection, and those would be second and third generation drugs. As far as the question of, whether it's the macrodosing paradigm, the in-clinic assisted psychotherapy, or more of a microdosing paradigm that wins the day, I think there's definitely room for both. Psychedelics have been around for quite a long time, but we're really only in the early innings of the next generation drug development.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Joe, are you going to add to that? Go ahead.
I agree with everything that James just said. He and I have a very similar perspective on the sector and the industry. And I do think that, one of the things that makes this industry so exciting to be a part of right now is the science is not settled. Maybe it's, as James says, maybe it's macrodosing, maybe it's microdosing, maybe there's a continuum. It's quite interesting to see as all this work is being done, and certainly at MagicMed, and I believe over at James's shop, we take the same sort of agnostic perspective. Let's make new molecules that, first off, of course, are patentable, but second, have the potential to, as James says, reduce a lot of side effects, have a variety of different activities, so that whatever it ends up being, we will have, great molecules that can go forward and get to a much wider patient population than, what I honestly think. It's probably a lot more narrow to go through the psychotherapy. The psychedelic assisted psychotherapy is probably a narrower patient population at the end of the day.
So, Hugh, I wanted to ask you, since you and your company come from cannabis and from cannabinoids, how can cannabinoids assist this whole drug development side of psychedelics, and how do you see your company fitting into all this scheme?
Yeah, that's interesting. So our approach, I'll start with the cannabis space. We're focused on drug formulation. So we acquired a German-based thin film drug development company. And we have a number of programs in the generic and hybrid generic space. Some of those overlap into cannabinoids. I think the relationship between cannabinoids and psychedelics is going to get very complicated. And I think, at least initially, our approach is to keep those separate. We are participating in the psychedelic industry as well, when it comes to standardization of API production, and then using our drug delivery expertise on the sublingual and buccal dissolvable forms in particular to develop precision dosing. So I think as we move away from, let's say a peyote or a cultivated psilocybin model into something that's standardized with more predictable dosing and bioavailability, I think, and then transition into these sort of second and third generation drugs. I guess the short answer would be there probably is some there's some potential there, but I think our approach is to keep them separate at this point in time. I'm not sure how Joseph and James feel about that, but I think it could get very complicated from a regulatory perspective to start mixing those two verticals.
Yeah, I jump in on that, Hugh. I totally agree. I've been developing drugs for a long time, and I'll tell you, you bring mixtures of molecules into the regulators, you're in for a world of hurt. So you definitely want to certainly kind of learn things that you can, what's happened as entities have tried to take, say, plant-derived but natural molecules through. What have they learned? But you really don't want to try to mix those things unless it's the only way that it actually will work. You definitely want to try to do monotherapies.
And I would just add to that, for if you're in the business of developing, next generation psychedelics, like Dr. Tucker and I are, there's the approach is really de-risked, right? Because at this point, we're building off of a really solid base of evidence that these drugs, work and have a benefit for people. So it's a bit of a different ball game than developing drugs in another biotech area. I think what we're probably both looking to do is really to try to improve on them. through making really small chemical modifications. So it makes it a bit of a different undertaking.
Yeah, I got to agree with you, James. This is one of those unique spaces where you take a look and it's pretty obvious that these molecules have a profound impact. There's no real question, right? So now it's, can we dial this in to get the best impact, the least side effects, and ultimately get these to patients, right? But you're right, so many pharmaceuticals, you're moving into it having no clue, do they really have much in the way of an impact? And human society has been using these for thousands of years to great effects. I think it's pretty obvious that they're going to work. Now it's just, let's make them safe. Let's get to the most patients possible.
So what do you think should happen to these molecules, or what are you doing to these molecules for them to be able to be taken at home without professional supervision? How can these molecules be changed and affected for people to open this sort of other huge market, which is the at-home market?
So there's the $1 billion question right there, right? How do you change them to make them effective while being able to get to all these patients, which, on the face of it, the first thing you think of is, well, if we can dial down the hallucination and still get the benefit, that would help a lot. Question is, science doesn't know if that's going to work or not. So I think that we're all coming at this from kind of the same approach, which is, so first off, as Sylvia said earlier, this is the serotonin, homeostasis, the serotonin metabolism we're talking about. There are a lot of different serotonin receptors. Modulating serotonin, that's what things like SSRIs do right now. So we know we're in the right in the right ballpark here, messing with this. And I think what we're all doing is making modifications to the molecules so that they will have different binding or agonism, antagonism with the different serotonin receptors, the different dopamine receptors, even the different NMDA receptors. I just realized I went super sciencey on everybody. Sorry about that. We're modifying the molecules, kind of a black box. We're going to see what happens there. That's the layperson's view.
Yeah, I think we really have to let the data in our programs guide where we take them, right? So one thing is for sure, there's a lot of groups now working on the downstream clinical indications, testing out different first generation drugs to determine how well they work for different indications. We think that there probably will be, for sure, there'll be some indications a little bit outside of what people are targeting with psychedelics today. So things like juvenile ADHD or potentially Alzheimer's, where a sub-hallucinogenic drug could work really well for them, because they're just population groups that you don't want to undergo a full psychedelic experience. But as far as is a non-hallucinogenic drug going to work for major depressive disorder or post-traumatic stress or one of these really big indications? We don't know. All the evidence right now and the data is on the side of the psychedelic experience being really critical to shutting down that overly busy ruminative part of a depressed person's brain that keeps them stuck in these negative thought patterns. Maybe you can get to it by dialing back the psychedelic experience, but that's not what the data shows right now. Or yet.
Yeah. I think this is a pretty interesting industry in the sense that it's quite unique, because there are these drugs that are being developed, but there's also this whole infrastructure that needs to be developed for the application of these drugs. So in that sense, psychedelics companies are pretty unique. But when you are moving into sub-hallucinogenic drugs, that's basically what every pharmaceutical company is doing. They're developing drugs that are not hallucinogenic. So what would you say, and maybe Hugh, if you want to chime in on this, what's the sort of first mover advantage of psychedelics companies when moving into non-hallucinogenic drugs? what can they offer that other pharmaceutical companies can't?
Well, I find it in the psychedelic industry, I think the most exciting thing for me is the potential for neuroplasticity. So you have this potential opportunity for long-term, potentially permanent changes in neurochemistry, and hopefully from smaller doses. I mean, I think that's borne out, as Joseph and James have noted, in larger dose therapies. Can we do it in smaller doses, in micro doses? Can we replace SSRIs and more conventional pharmaceuticals? I think the jury's still out on that, but it is very exciting, and I see this potential for, let's say, long-term change as the most exciting part of the industry.
Mm. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think larger pharma companies have for years been trying to get away from any. There's a well-known serotonin receptor that is, activity there is highly correlated with the psychedelic experience. And so, pharmaceutical companies have really been trying to develop drugs that didn't go anywhere near that receptor. I think that probably the psychedelic companies have a bit of an advantage because I don't think any, at Mindset, we're interested in drugs that potentially still, activate that receptor. So they're not selective away from it. But they're just activating it a little less or substantially less than the well-known psychedelics.
Well, that was an interesting way to put it. Okay, so without further ado, for those in the audience who are only waiting to hear about the financial part of the psychedelics industry, our moment has come. Sylvia, I imagine that you've been tracking this industry for a while. Can you give us a little overview of what's been happening? I mean, I believe I read recently that there was something like in 2017, there were like $1 million invested in the entire industry, and now it's like in the hundreds of millions. So how do you see the development of the industry from 3 years ago, maybe 5 years ago to today? And yeah, we can start there.
Yeah, sure. So I think you sort of laid it out pretty well a few years ago when there was no sort of thought that this would go anywhere, or perhaps I shouldn't even say a few years ago because it's really a few decades ago. When again there was like this view that these drugs should be criminalized and absolutely cut off and whatnot. But now that the phase 1, 2, 3 trials are coming out from Johns Hopkins and Cornell and MAPS, now you kind of see, to your point, this 3,000% fold type of investment going into these sectors. Peter Thiel is apparently going to invest, like upwards into the hundreds of millions into one company. But the estimates out there are that billions of dollars are going to go into this space. And if you just think about, again, the worldwide cost of treating mental illness is $2.5 trillion. If you even consider that cannabis and psychedelics are a small part of what could be, I think it's in the multi-billions. So, and if you look at some of these companies, like MindMed is one of the companies that we invest in, or that we have in our ETF anyway. And if you look at like from the beginning of 2020 until now, they're up like 700%. I mean, they're still sub $5 stocks in a lot of cases, but I think investors are really starting to pay attention to these types of products. You see their market cap slowly growing. You see, investors coming in, private equity coming into the space. So it's really hard to predict what it'll be, but the numbers that people are putting out there are in the hundreds of billions of dollars between now and 2025.
Mm. Yeah. Joe, you had some interesting comments on this that you shared the other day. So yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So my personal experience, both being in it and also watching the sector mature over the last few years, has been, I think, an interesting shift, maybe in the perspective of the investors coming in, and also really the identity of the investors. The first wave in my opinion, was mostly driven by a retail Canadian investor. Love the retail Canadian investors. I'm one myself, but it's, they get excited about ideas and tend to pile in, which is great. But then you get to a point, and I think we've seen that in the psychedelics now, that as folks like the other members of this panel will tell you all day long, because they're living it, is this is really about drug development. It's really about making true pharmaceuticals. It's not a cannabis CPG play. And so this investor base, I think right now we're going through a transition. We're moving into sophisticated life science investors based mainly in the United States, a lot of them in California, some out on the East Coast. And those investors are looking for different things. They're looking for a different story, different intellectual property, a different, what's this company doing? So I think that's a transition that we're going through right now. That's why you're seeing so much excitement over entities that are trying to get, say, listed on the NASDAQ as opposed to stay on the CSE, right? Everybody would like to make that transition because we want to get in front of those sophisticated life science investors. To Sylvia's point, we're going to need billions and billions of dollars to get these drugs all the way through clinical trials. It's totally worth it, but you need that sophisticated patient life science investor. And luckily, I think that's the transition that's taking place right now in the sector, and we're seeing it in the markets.
And what do you think, and anyone that feels like they have an answer, because this is a hard question, what do you think is the kind of company profile that is going to be driving interest for investors in the maybe next year? If you feel like you have an answer, and if you can't predict the future, just we can move on to a different question.
Well, the psychedelics really are a new biotech class, aren't they? And so I think that it's attracting, like Dr. Tucker said, it's starting to attract serious biotech investors, and they're looking for the same things out of psychedelic companies that they look for in any other space, which is differentiated, patent protected drugs that are on a pathway into a clinical stage and ultimately through regulatory acceptance. Those are the things that they're going to be looking for. Definitely early 2020. To echo the previous comment, there was a real kind of lack of clarity, I think, around what would be important in the psychedelic market. But I think, that's definitely shifted now, and so I think it'll be what's important in any biotech company.
Yeah, and I would just add to what James just said one thing, which is, because what he was just describing was really that competitive advantage. And I think there's also a small subset of companies that have a competitive advantage that doesn't really come from intellectual property. And it's those first few, the companies like Compass that are out in front of everybody else. They don't really have solid IP. I'm sorry to break it to you. It's not that solid what they have, but they are way out in front of everybody else. And so they're going to have a first mover advantage into those markets. So I think there's a few like that. The ones, honestly, that like Atai and MindMed, the ones that have made it to the big leagues, if you will, early on, they have that advantage. But for everybody else, they're going to really need to differentiate themselves exactly like James just said.
And as another class of biotech companies, maybe Sylvia or Hugh, you would like to comment on what kind of M&A action do you see in the sector from biotech and from cannabis, which are, I think, two big industries that could start blending in with psychedelics companies?
Yeah, I think if you look at, you can just sort of see the future. I think it was a good way to describe this is the next biotech play, right? So we actually dabbled in creating a micro, junior biotech product too. And we thought that the reason for that to be interesting is because a lot of the large biotech companies that spend all of their money on marketing, like the Pfizers and the J&Js and stuff, they spend all their money on marketing and that kind of thing. And I think that sometimes to get research and new products out the door, they just have to buy someone. So I wouldn't be surprised if the same thing happens here. You have Johnson and Johnson, for example, starting up psychedelic. I think they do a little bit, but I think they're going to invest more heavily in psychedelic studies. Like, you have to wonder at some point, like, do they just try to target and buy a company that's a little bit further along, especially if it's true that, what MAPS is saying, that by the end of 2021, you get FDA approval to start administering this in clinical settings. There's going to be a race. And I think the companies that are sort of in the forefront or have, the good results will benefit from that. But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised to see M&A in the space.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I would add, I think you mentioned cannabis versus pharmaceuticals. I think there's a big difference between a GW Pharma and a Cannabis, for example. So I think, to echo the statements, this is a pharmaceutical drug development business. So I think we will see M&A.
And what other sort of benefits or perks could a cannabis company have into coming to psychedelics? I imagine that a lot of regulatory hurdles are already passed, and you already have like a compliance team and another. Yeah.
I mean, we're already I've seen in actually a number of companies in Canada, for example, branded and, let's say, preparing for some sort of a recreational psychedelic industry. That's a pretty big bet. I'm not sure that's going to happen. And it started in this sort of functional mushroom space, and they've got heavily branded products, and they've basically taken the cannabis model and applied it to psychedelics. That's not a bet we're taking. We're purely science-based. First generation, that's API production and drug formulation. Second generation, chemical engineering and clinical validation. I think that's the way to participate in this market.
Yeah, yes, there are definitely companies that are moving into the recreational space. What kind of market do their panelists see there? Do you see possible revenues coming from there, or is it just too difficult to have something moving there?
I'm staying away from that space. I think that's a tough row to hoe.
Yeah,
I think it's a long ways away. Even if it happens, like, you have to think that this has to go through the phase 3 trial, and then it has to get approved for medical setting, and then you're going to have specific patients that are qualified and permitted to use it, and then maybe you have the centers opening up, and then maybe insurance companies start to think about covering it, and then it becomes something that you take home. And I just think I think that's decades away. I mean, I'm sure, the sort of illegal use of it continues, but in terms of actual, sort of like retail sales to the general community, I feel like that's a ways away.
Yeah, I think it's important for people to keep in mind, decriminalization is not the same thing as legalization. I'd say, like, some of the decriminalization's happening faster than, I would have thought it was going to a year ago, and I think it's exciting in some ways. It's not a part of our business at all. And even if it were to be decriminalized, across all of the USA, it still doesn't mean you can run a business, selling drugs into it. So, yeah. Yeah,
there are some jurisdictions that are opening up. So some companies definitely are seeing opportunity there. Maybe Red Light Holland is one of them. They're trying to move maybe into the Oregon market, but it's definitely a very different business model to what the companies presenting here are aiming at. Yeah.
I agree.
And here's Elliot to tell us that we don't have.
No, I'm the evil overlord. I've actually been called that before at these events. But y'all, wonderful panel, wonderful discussion around psychedelics. My screen is freezing, so I have zero idea if you can see me or not. But regardless, it has been a pleasure to listen in on this, and the future of psychedelics, I think, is very, very optimistic. So I appreciate you all having this discussion. We'll talk to you all very soon.
Thanks.
You're powerful, but you're very kind, Elliot. So thank you for the time, and yeah.
Of course. See you guys soon.